The silence after a war is never truly quiet. It lingers in the bones, in the air, in the way people breathe a little sharper than before. You would think that with the stars full of life, with galaxies wide open, someone else would carry the burden of battle. But again and again it fell on us, humans. Not because we wanted it, not because we loved it, but because no one else could bear the weight. That was the curse of being human, the reluctant throne of war, one we never asked to sit upon. The first contact had not been what the dreamers hoped for. There were no outstretched hands, no gifts of peace, no kind greetings. There was only the demand to kneel. And when humanity refused, the stars burned with conflict. Aliens expected us to fold, to shatter under pressure, but they had not learned the long history etched into our very skin. We were born from struggle, carved by survival, shaped by endless wars that taught us not only how to fight, but how to endure. That was the one truth no empire could strip from us. The galaxy had predators, yes, but none like us. We were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most intelligent. What set us apart was something colder, harder to break. We carried our scars like banners, our grief like iron, our memories of loss like sharpened blades. And when they thought they could break us, they found themselves staring into the eyes of a species that had already been broken countless times, yet still stood. It was said in whispers across alien halls that humans never wanted war, yet they never lost one. We didn't fight to conquer. We fought because we had to. Every battle was survival, every campaign an act of defiance. And the more they pressed us, the more relentless we became. There was no crown more hated, no throne more cursed than the one we held. But the truth was, humanity was tired. Tired of battles, tired of graves, tired of being called the galaxy's warriors when all we wanted was peace. People dreamed of quiet skies, of laughter instead of alarms. Yet peace always slipped away, torn from our hands the moment it seemed within reach. Because somewhere out there, some empire, some coalition always looked to us and thought, they are too dangerous to leave alone. And so it began again. The latest war was not one of our making. It never was. A coalition of alien powers struck, convinced humanity was too fractured, too weary, too unprepared to rise again. They struck colonies first, burning worlds that had never even seen soldiers before. They thought fear would cripple us. Instead, it lit something deep inside. There was a moment, small, almost fragile, when ordinary people looked at one another and understood. If we ran, we would be hunted. If we begged, we would be enslaved. If we surrendered, we would be erased. The galaxy left no space for weakness. And so, once again, humanity climbed back onto the throne we despised. The reluctant masters of warfare had been summoned to the battlefield. It wasn't the soldiers who carried the burden alone. It was the farmers who abandoned their fields to forge weapons. The engineers who turned cargo ships into war machines. The parents who kissed their children goodbye, not knowing if they would ever return. Every soul became part of the struggle. Humanity fought not as armies but as one. And still, beneath the steel and the fire, there was grief. You could see it in the eyes of commanders who had fought too many wars, in the trembling hands of those who pressed the launch button, knowing it meant lives lost on both sides. Humans did not love war. But war loved us, and it never seemed to let us go. The aliens had thought we would collapse under the weight of too many battles. But that was their mistake. They didn't understand that the more the world tried to break us, the stronger our resolve became. They didn't understand the depth of loss we had carried for thousands of years, or the way it bound us together. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't weapons or strategy. It was something harder to measure. It was the refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed easier. It was the stubborn heartbeat that kept going when everything else had fallen. Yet deep down, fear gnawed at us. What if this time was different? What if this time the galaxy had truly united against us? No species had ever fought so many at once. The numbers alone were staggering. And though humans had faced impossible odds before, no one could deny the scale of what was coming. This was not a war of skirmishes or border raids. This was an attempt to erase us completely. Rumors spread. Whispers of fleets larger than anything we had ever seen. Worlds already lost. Leaders debating if survival was even possible. And somewhere in the shadows, voices rose, arguing that perhaps this was our punishment, that maybe the galaxy was right to fear us. Maybe humanity was cursed to be warriors and nothing else. But for every voice of doubt, another rose in defiance. People who had nothing left still chose to fight. Even those who hated the idea of battle found themselves forging blades, manning ships, preparing defenses. Because humanity understood one truth more clearly than any other. Once you lose the will to stand, you lose everything. Now, as fleets gather and worlds brace for fire, A single question hangs in the air. Will humanity rise again, or will the throne of war finally consume us? The galaxy waits, some with fear, others with hope, to see if we can bear the weight one more time. And as the first enemy fleets slip from the void, descending upon human worlds with shadows as vast as night itself, there is no turning back. The alarms scream, voices call out, and the skies burn. Once again, unwilling, unwanted, unbroken, humanity takes its seat on the reluctant throne of war. The story begins there, in the moment between fear and defiance, in the breath before the first shot is fired. Because what happens next will decide not only the fate of one species, but the fate of an entire galaxy that has yet to understand what it truly means to fight against us. And somewhere in the silence before the battle, one thought lingers. If humanity rises this time, will anyone be left standing when it's over? The first fleets came like shadows swallowing the stars. No warning, no declaration, no chance for diplomacy. One moment, the night skies above the outer colonies shimmered with peace. The next, they burned with fire. People had always imagined war would come with time to prepare, with banners raised and leaders giving speeches. Instead, it arrived like a thief, tearing through worlds before most even understood they were under attack. The broadcasts spread fast. Shattered transmissions from distant colonies played across every channel. A child's voice crying as alarms wailed in the background. A soldier's last message cut short by static. A grainy feed of alien warships blotting out a planet's sun. Humanity, no matter how spread across the stars, shared the same dreadful realization. The war had begun again. And this time the enemy was not one empire or one rival species. It was many. The coalition had formed in secret, bound together not by trust but by fear of us. For centuries, the galaxy had whispered about humanity's strange resilience, our reckless courage, our refusal to stay broken. Alone, those empires had fought us and failed. Together, they believed they could finally end the threat of humankind. Their fleets were vast, their resources endless, their intent merciless. They would not stop until every human world was ash. Yet in the heart of the storm, people did not fall to despair. They clung to something older than hope, stubbornness. Across shattered colonies, survivors gathered, refusing to be erased. Some picked up weapons though they had never fired one before. Others carried the wounded, their own hands shaking with fear but refusing to let go. There were no speeches then, no grand promises. Just ordinary people choosing, again and again, to stand instead of kneel. The military scrambled to respond, but the truth was bitter. We were unprepared. For years, leaders had argued that humanity needed rest, not war. Soldiers had been discharged, fleets reduced, weapons dismantled in the name of peace. No one wanted to believe we would be forced into the throne of war once more. But the galaxy had never cared about what we wanted. It only cared about what it feared. Commanders looked at star maps and saw disaster looming. Entire sectors could be lost within days. Some argued to retreat, to gather strength in the inner worlds. Others demanded immediate counterstrikes. The debates grew heated, filled with desperation and dread. But beneath it all, a truth gnawed at every leader. No matter what choice they made, lives would be lost. The question was only how many and how fast. Even then, amid fear and uncertainty, humanity's spirit burned. Engineers worked without rest, converting freighters into warships, mining vessels into makeshift carriers. Old veterans returned, pulling dusty uniforms from closets, their eyes hardened by memories of wars long past. Young recruits, barely grown, stepped forward not because they loved battle, but because they refused to watch their homes fall without resistance. Each one carried the same weight, the knowledge that they were fighting not for conquest but survival. The enemy underestimated that. They saw us as fractured, exhausted, stretched thin across too many stars. They believed their numbers would crush us. What they did not understand was that numbers alone could not match the fury of a people who had been hunted too many times to count. Humanity had always found strength in the impossible, in the places where logic said we should already be gone. Still, doubt lingered. Every transmission of a burning colony cut deeper. Every list of the dead grew longer. Mothers wept for children lost, and children wept for parents who would never return. Soldiers fought with clenched jaws, haunted by the fear that even if they won, they would be nothing but ghosts by the end. Humanity's heart was strong, but hearts can break, and every hour of the war pressed harder against that truth. The coalition made its move carefully, targeting not just military worlds, but civilian ones, believing that terror would fracture humanity's will. Yet with every strike they only fueled the fire. On a frozen mining colony where all defenses had failed, survivors lit beacons with their last breath, sending a single message into the void. We are still here. We will not bow. That message spread like wildfire, repeated across every world, a rallying cry stronger than any fleet. But behind the courage lay questions no one could answer. Why now? Why had the galaxy chosen this moment to strike together? What secret bound so many rival empires into unity? Some whispered of hidden technology, of an ancient weapon humanity had uncovered that frightened the galaxy into action. Others believed there was something deeper, something the coalition feared about humanity's very existence. But the truth remained shrouded in silence, buried beneath the roar of battle. And in the quiet moments between firestorms, people felt it, the throne of war closing in around them again. Humanity had never wanted it, never sought it. Yet here we were, forced back onto that cursed seat, holding it not with pride but with weary hands. There was no glory in it, only survival. Only the grim knowledge that if we let go we would vanish forever. The first great clash of fleets loomed. Reports poured in of enemy armadas converging on one of humanity's oldest strongholds, a planet not only rich in resources but sacred in memory. It was the world where humanity had first reached the stars, where the first ships had left orbit to touch the galaxy beyond. If it fell, it would not just be a loss of land. It would be the breaking of our spirit. Commanders gathered in hushed war rooms, staring at maps that showed the impossible. Wave after wave of enemy ships stretching beyond imagination. Defenses were weak. Reinforcements were days away. By all calculations the planet could not hold. But when the news reached its people there was no panic, no surrender. Instead, every citizen, soldier or not, swore to fight until the skies themselves burned out. They would not abandon the birthplace of humanity's reach for the stars. And so the stage was set. Humanity's reluctant throne of war stood unshaken, even as the weight of entire civilizations pressed against it. Across the galaxy, whispers rose in fear and awe. Some called us cursed. Others called us inevitable. But everyone, friend and foe alike, knew one thing. The war was only beginning and humanity's answer to extinction had not yet been spoken. Somewhere deep in the dark, the coalition's fleets gathered, their shadows blotting out the light. Humanity's defenses stirred, weary yet unbroken. Between them stretched a silence, vast and suffocating, the silence before the storm. And within that silence, the question hung like a blade over every heart. When the fire comes, will we endure again, or will this be the war that finally ends us? The skies above the stronghold world were heavy with dread. Every telescope, every satellite, every soldier's eyes were fixed on the horizon of space, waiting for the moment when the first enemy warship would emerge. The silence before their arrival was unbearable, like the sharp intake of breath before a scream. Families clung to each other in underground shelters, while soldiers walked the barricades, checking weapons that they knew might not be enough. It wasn't just about metal or strategy anymore. This was about holding on to the soul of humanity itself. Commanders studied the star maps, but the truth was written in their faces. The odds were impossible. Hundreds of thousands of enemy ships pressed toward them, a wall of steel and fire so vast it seemed like a second night sky had been born. And yet, not a single soldier spoke of retreat. They had chosen to fight here, knowing this planet meant everything. To abandon it would mean abandoning the story of who they were. As the first enemy signals lit up the void, the tension across the planet grew sharp enough to cut. Civilians sat in shelters, holding radios to their ears, listening to every coded message. Children asked if they would survive the night, and parents gave the only answer they could: "We will try." The fear was there, raw and heavy, but it carried something else too, a fire that could not be put out. Humanity had been here before, staring into the abyss, and each time it had found a way to endure. When the coalition fleets finally appeared, the sky turned black. One after another, massive warships dropped out of the void, stretching across the stars until they seemed endless. The ground shook as orbital defenses powered up, their cannons glowing with energy. On the surface, soldiers braced themselves, watching the heavens darken under the enemy's shadow. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses, and many stood in silence, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that the battle was about to decide everything. The first volleys came without warning. Blinding lances of energy tore through the upper atmosphere, hammering shields and burning holes in orbital stations. The planet shook as explosions rippled across its sky. Defenses fired back, answering with everything they had, but the enemy numbers were overwhelming. Each time one alien ship fell, 10 more slipped forward. The coalition had come prepared to erase this world, and they unleashed their fury with no hesitation. Still the human fleet stood. Outnumbered, outgunned but not outwilled. Captains barked orders, pilots dove into impossible battles, and soldiers in orbit fought to hold the line one breath longer. In the chaos, there was no room for hesitation. Every second mattered. Every sacrifice bought time. And every life lost was another reminder of why they could not afford to give up. On the ground, tension built as reports streamed in, stations lost, ships destroyed, fleets breaking apart. Yet even with the walls closing in, humanity refused to collapse. Old men and women carried ammunition to the barricades. Children who should have been hiding in fear sang the old songs of Earth in the shelters, their voices trembling but unbroken. Engineers worked with bleeding hands, repairing weapons even as fire fell around them. Humanity's strength had never been in its machines. It was in its people. But the pressure was unbearable. Each hour brought more losses. Enemy ships began to breach the orbital lines, their shadows casting over the planet's surface. Troop carriers loomed, ready to unleash soldiers of the coalition onto the soil of humanity's birthplace among the stars. The defenders prepared for the ground battle they had prayed would never come. They knew if the enemy landed, it would no longer be a war of ships and shields, it would be a war of streets, of blood, of survival in the dirt itself. Commanders argued in hushed voices, their choices narrowing. Some wanted to unleash weapons of last resort, weapons that could scorch the skies themselves but at terrible cost. Others demanded that they hold back, that humanity must not sacrifice its soul even in the face of annihilation. But there was no time to debate. The enemy was closing in, faster than anyone had expected. Every hesitation was another opening for the coalition. Still, hope flickered in strange places. Reports came of small victories, of outnumbered fighters striking down ships far larger than themselves, of ground units holding back enemy landers long enough for defenses to regroup. Ordinary people, untrained and unprepared, stood beside soldiers and refused to yield. These moments did not change the tide of battle, but they lit sparks, tiny flashes of defiance that burned even in the deepest night. The climax of the war pressed closer with every passing second. The stronghold world trembled under the weight of fire raining from the heavens. Soldiers on the front lines clutched their weapons tighter, knowing that soon they would face the enemy face to face. Civilians in shelters held hands, listening as explosions drew nearer, feeling the rumble of war in their bones. Humanity as a whole leaned forward into the storm, carrying both fear and fury in equal measure. And then the moment came. Alarms screamed across every station, every ship, every shelter. The enemy's final push had begun. Massive carriers broke through the defenses, blotting out the skies as they descended. Thousands of troop ships followed, spilling out of the void like a swarm of locusts. It was the full weight of the coalition, pressing down on one planet, determined to crush humanity once and for all. Every soldier knew what it meant. This was the battle that would decide the future. There would be no retreat, no second chance. The throne of war had pulled humanity into its grasp once again, and now it demanded the heaviest price. The skies burned with fire, the ground shook with the weight of invasion, and the hearts of every man, woman, and child beat with the same question. Would this be the day humanity finally broke? Or would the reluctant masters of war rise one last time, against the greatest darkness the galaxy had ever seen? The answer had not yet come. The world held its breath as the storm fell upon it. And in that moment, the future of an entire species balanced on the edge of a blade. The enemy's carriers split the skies, blotting out the sun as they descended, and for a moment it felt as though the world itself was being buried alive. The thunder of their engines shook the mountains and rattled the bones of everyone waiting below. Humanity braced for the impact of war on the ground, believing this was the moment when the worst would come crashing down. But then something no one expected happened. The coalition did not land. Not at first. Instead, they began to circle the atmosphere, releasing smaller craft that shimmered with strange light. These were not troop ships or heavy bombers, they were something different. Machines unlike any humanity had seen before drifted downward, spreading out like a net, forming patterns in the skies. At first, commanders thought they were deploying orbital shields or communications arrays. But soon their true purpose became horrifyingly clear. The machines began to pulse with energy, sending waves across the planet that made radios crackle and sensors scream with static. Entire defense grids flickered, weapons went dark and power systems collapsed one after another. Humanity had prepared for overwhelming fleets, for brutal ground war, for endless waves of soldiers. But not for this. The coalition had brought a weapon designed not to destroy us with fire, but to strip us of the very tools we depended on. Panic rippled through command centers as systems shut down. Entire squadrons of fighters fell silent, their engines stuttering in mid-flight. Orbital cannons powered down just as enemy carriers drew closer. Even personal weapons on the ground sparked uselessly in soldiers' hands. Humanity had fought wars with courage, with stubbornness, with iron, but in this moment the war turned into something else. Survival without technology. The revelation hit hard. The coalition had not underestimated humanity after all. They had studied us, watched us, learned our habits, and now they had brought a weapon to erase everything we had built. In the silence of dead machines, commanders whispered the same fear. Had the galaxy always feared not just our will to fight, but the fact that, stripped of everything, we would still refuse to break? On the ground, soldiers gritted their teeth, gripping weapons that no longer hummed with power. Families in shelters felt the lights go out, plunging them into suffocating darkness broken only by the distant rumble of enemy engines. For a heartbeat, despair pressed down heavier than the skies themselves. If the coalition could tear away everything we depended on, what chance was left? And then, like sparks in the dark, the second twist began to show itself. Even without machines, even without power, people did not stop. Soldiers ripped apart disabled weapons, turning them into makeshift tools. Engineers lit fires to work by hand, hammering scraps of metal into crude defenses. Civilians poured out of shelters carrying nothing but determination, ready to fight with whatever they could hold. Humanity was being forced backward in time, stripped of its fleets and its firepower, pushed into the dirt. But instead of breaking, it awakened something older, something buried deep in our history. The coalition had intended to paralyze us, to break the war before it began. Instead, they had driven us into the kind of battle we understood better than anyone else. A fight where survival was raw, where every stone, every blade, every breath became a weapon. For all their technology, the galaxy had forgotten this truth. Humans had been killing each other long before machines. We had carried war in our hands, in our bones, in our will to survive long before we touched the stars. But the coalition had another move waiting. As humanity scrambled to adjust, the enemy finally began their descent. Massive troop carriers ripped through the clouds, deploying endless streams of soldiers and war machines. But they weren't the only ones to land. Alongside them came something worse. Creatures bred for war, monstrous forms designed to tear through flesh and crush bone, beasts unleashed like living weapons. The coalition hadn't just brought fleets, they had brought nightmares. The sight of them sent waves of fear across human lines. For a heartbeat, it seemed like too much. Our weapons disabled, our defenses stripped, and now these horrors dropping from the skies. But in that moment, as terror spread, something else rose too. A fury that no machine could silence, no shadow could smother. Soldiers picked up steel blades forged in panic. Farmers swung tools meant for soil but now raised for war. Children who should have been hiding pressed stones into their hands, swearing they would not cower. The stage for the climax of humanity's survival was no longer just a battle of ships in the sky. It was becoming something far more brutal, far more personal. Every street, every hill, every corner of the stronghold world would become a battleground. The coalition thought they had forced us into weakness, but all they had done was awaken the most dangerous version of humanity, the one that fights when there is nothing left to lose. As the first ground-shaking impacts of enemy landers echoed across the planet, and the monstrous creatures of war roared into the night, the truth became clear. This was not just about holding a world anymore. This was about proving once again why the galaxy had feared us enough to unite. Because when the throne of war dragged humanity into its grip, no enemy ever left unscarred. The ground trembled, the skies burned, and humanity braced itself for the storm to break fully. And somewhere in the chaos, one haunting thought pierced through the fear. If this is how the coalition planned to end us, what would they unleash next when they realized we still would not fall? The ground split beneath the weight of war. Alien machines stormed across the soil, their claws tearing through human barricades, their towering silhouettes blotting out the last glimmers of hope. The beasts bred for battle roared, charging into lines of soldiers who held nothing more than blades, spears, and fire-forged weapons hammered together in the darkness. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the thunder of a world shaking under the coalition's might. It should have been the end. Every calculation, every chart, every prediction screamed it. Humanity's weapons had been silenced, our fleets shattered, our machines stripped of power. And yet the lines did not break. People fought with their bare hands, with the rage of a species too tired of being hunted to bow again. A soldier drove a steel pike into the chest of a beast twice his size. A mother, clutching her child with one arm, hurled fire into the face of an enemy machine with the other. Engineers turned broken engines into bombs. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans, their eyes filled not with fear, but with grim determination. The coalition expected submission. What they found instead was defiance that burned hotter with every loss. The planet became a storm of resistance. Every street was a battlefield, every ruin a fortress, every fallen human a reason for the others to fight harder. The throne of war, heavy and cursed, had once again chosen humanity, and this time they wore it not with pride but with fury. The climax came when the coalition finally unleashed their greatest weapon. At the heart of their fleet hovered a massive warship unlike any other, its core pulsing with the same strange energy that had disabled humanity's technology. It was the anchor of the invasion, the source of the suppression waves that had crippled every defense. As long as it remained, humanity would be fighting in the dirt, bleeding into the soil until nothing was left. Commanders across broken comms reached the same conclusion. The warship had to fall. Without it, the suppression would end, humanity's fleets and weapons could return, and the tide might shift. But no one knew how to reach it. Every fighter was disabled, every orbital cannon silenced. The enemy fortress floated above them, untouchable. It was then that the impossible idea rose. Not from the war rooms, not from the commanders, but from the people on the ground. A group of engineers and soldiers, working with what little remained, crafted a desperate plan. If they could not reach the warship with machines, they would do it with will. They took an old freighter, gutted and stripped, and rebuilt it with their bare hands. No guidance systems, no shields, no weapons. Only engines that might burn long enough for one last flight. They filled its core with every explosive they could carry, every last reserve of fuel, every scrap of energy they could steal from the dying world below. It was a coffin, but a coffin with teeth. When the ship launched, its engines screaming raw fire into the night, the entire planet looked to the skies. They knew what it meant. They knew what those inside had chosen. The coalition opened fire, tearing chunks from its hull, but still it climbed. The freighter staggered, burning, breaking apart piece by piece, yet the humans aboard refused to let it fall. Through smoke and fire, they guided it upward, closer and closer to the heart of the enemy fleet. The coalition warship turned its full attention to the threat, beams of energy tearing through space, shredding everything around it. But it was too late. The freighter, nothing more than a wounded beast dragging itself forward, slammed into the enemy ship's core. The explosion was not just fire, it was freedom. A blinding wave tore across the skies, shattering the suppression field in an instant. Across the planet, weapons roared back to life, fleets reignited, and humanity rose with renewed fury. The tide turned in a heartbeat. Orbital cannons lit the sky with vengeance. Fighters that had been dead in the void sprang back to life, tearing into the coalition's ranks. Soldiers on the ground raised weapons that finally hummed with power again, cutting down the machines and beasts that had driven them to the edge. The planet that had seemed doomed only moments before now erupted with fire and defiance, and the coalition realized too late what it meant to face humanity unshackled. The coalition fleets faltered. Ships scattered, commanders shouted in panic, the unity that had once seemed unstoppable cracked apart under the weight of failure. Humanity pressed the attack, not with the hunger of conquerors, but with the desperation of survivors who had finally found their breath. Every shot, every strike, every explosion was a declaration. We will not be erased. And yet, just as the war seemed won, the final twist revealed itself. Amid the chaos of the collapsing fleet, a message cut through the void, an intercepted transmission not meant for human ears. The coalition had not come together simply to destroy humanity out of fear. They had come because something else was stirring in the galaxy, something ancient, something neither human nor alien empire could control. The war, for all its horror, was not the true battle. Humanity was not just fighting for survival against enemies, it was being tested, forced into the throne of war for a reason no one yet understood. As the coalition broke and scattered, leaving the stronghold world scarred but unbroken, humanity stood bloodied, exhausted but alive. People wept for the fallen, clung to one another in the ruins, and whispered of the impossible victory they had carved from despair. Yet beneath the relief lay a new shadow. If the coalition had been driven by fear of something greater, then this war was only the beginning. Humanity had survived, yes, but the throne of war had not released them. It had only prepared them for what was coming next. The fires of the battlefield still burned, but already the question spread through the ranks of the living, heavy and haunting. If the galaxy had united to stop us, then what terror could make them risk everything to keep us ready for the wars still to come? The silence after the storm of war was heavy, almost unbearable. It wasn't the silence of peace, not yet. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of people standing in the ruins of what they had fought to protect, unsure if they had truly won or if they had only delayed the inevitable. The battlefield still smelled of fire and metal, and though the sky was clear, no one felt light. The war had ended with a twist no one saw coming. The enemy, so sure of their strength, had not been defeated by weapons alone. They had been undone by something far more human: our refusal to break, our stubbornness to keep fighting even when everything was lost. We hadn't chosen to become masters of war, but the galaxy had forced that crown on us. And now, as the dust settled, the weight of that crown pressed harder than ever. People stood together in clusters, some crying, some too numb to cry at all. Soldiers who had marched forward with fire in their hearts now looked down at their hands, as if realizing for the first time the price of survival. The war had stripped away illusions and left only truth. Humanity was strong, but that strength came with scars that would never fully heal. Across the broken lines, the surviving enemy commanders watched us in silence. They had expected cruelty, vengeance, maybe even the complete destruction of their kind. But what they saw instead was restraint. The humans did not cheer. They did not gloat. They carried their dead and tended their wounded, and in their quiet grief, there was a dignity that made the enemy feel small. That was the final message humanity sent without saying a word. We do not love war, but we will not bow to it either. We fight because we must, not because we crave it. And that was what made us dangerous beyond measure. Leaders walked among their people, offering words that could never fully heal but at least reminded everyone they weren't alone. The weight of leadership had never been heavier. It wasn't just about guiding humanity anymore, it was about guiding the galaxy, because every species that had witnessed this war now looked at us differently. Some saw us as protectors, others as a threat, but none could deny that humans had changed the balance forever. Children clung to their parents, asking when the fighting would be over for good. No one could give them a certain answer. Peace was possible, maybe even within reach, but history had taught us that war had a way of finding humanity, even when we tried to walk away. Still, the hope was there, faint but alive. Ships hovered in the skies above, silent reminders of the battles that had raged only hours before. Some were damaged beyond repair, drifting like ghosts. Others were still functional, waiting for orders. And in the quiet of those command decks, decisions were made that would shape the future. How to rebuild, how to keep watch, how to ensure that this war would not have to be fought again. But deep inside, everyone knew the truth. Humanity could not escape war. We might reject it, we might resist it, but in the end we were too good at it, too experienced, too relentless. That throne of war, the one we never wanted, was still ours, no matter how much we longed to leave it behind. Yet there was a final twist waiting, a reminder that even after victory the universe never stayed still. From the shadows came whispers, another enemy, one not broken but waiting. A distant signal, faint but real, hinted at something stirring beyond the stars. Whether it was friend or foe, no one could yet tell. But humanity felt it deep in their bones. The war was over, but the story wasn't finished. For now, though, there was a choice to make. We could rebuild in fear, living as if the next battle was already on its way, or we could rebuild in hope, daring to imagine a world where children grew without hearing the thunder of guns. Humanity had always been at its strongest when cornered, but maybe, just maybe, we could be stronger in peace. As night fell, people lit small fires, not for destruction, but for warmth. Around those fires, stories were told of the ones who had been lost, of the bravery shown in impossible moments, of how ordinary people had done extraordinary things. And in those stories, the crown of war felt lighter, because it wasn't worn by a single leader or soldier. It was carried by all of humanity together. The enemy survivors, too, began to see something they hadn't expected. They had thought war was about power, about who could strike hardest and endure longest. But in the way humanity mourned and remembered, they saw a different kind of power. One that came from unity, from refusing to forget, from refusing to let war erase who we were. That realization spread like wildfire, and even among those who had fought against us, respect took root. In the days that followed, treaties were drafted, fragile but real. The galaxy watched closely, wondering if this peace would hold or if it was only another pause before the cycle began again. But for humanity, the decision was clear. We would not let the galaxy drag us into endless battles without reason. If war came again, we would meet it. But we would never seek it. That was our reluctant promise, born from the reluctant throne we carried. A throne built not from pride but from necessity, not from conquest but from survival. It was a throne that no one envied but everyone respected. And so, as the last fires of war dimmed, humanity stood on the edge of something new. The scars of battle remained, carved deep into the earth and into our hearts, but so did the strength that came from enduring them. We had fought, we had endured, and we had won, not just the war but the right to decide who we would be in its aftermath. The galaxy would remember humanity as warriors. That much was certain. But perhaps, in time, they would also remember us as something more. Builders, dreamers, survivors who chose peace when they could have chosen dominance. The reluctant throne of war still rested on our shoulders. But as the dawn broke on a battered world, humanity chose to rise not as conquerors, but as guardians of the fragile hope we had fought so hard to keep alive. And in that choice, the story of war ended, not in silence, not in despair, but in the quiet, unshakable belief that even the masters of war could become the keepers of peace.